Sustain257.
Welcome to the Sustain257 Podcast, where we host conversations on different issues affecting climate change in Botswana and the rest of Africa. I am your host, Batokili Sidze. Today we are back on the topic of sustainable fashion. So around November 2018, I came across a United Nations article that left quite a mark on me. This article was about the fashion industry and how harmful the fashion industry is to the environment. To give you an idea, the fashion industry is one of the top 5 most wasteful industries, responsible for nearly 10% of the global carbon footprint, and is the second biggest consumer of water, generating around 20% of the world's wastewater and 24% of insecticides and 11% of pesticides. That article moved me to challenge myself to a year of not buying any new clothes. That year then stretched to becoming 2.5 years of me not buying any new clothes. So this includes secondhand clothes as well. I only wore the clothes I already had, and I'm lucky enough to be the smallest of my friends, so they also continued to give me the clothes that they had outgrown. Unfortunately, with all my clothes now becoming rather well worn, I must head back to shopping. However, I'd like to do this in a way that creates the least impact to the environment and in the most conscious and sustainable way. I then reached out to one half of the Conscious blog, conscious fashion advocate Masego, popularly known as Coconut Cracked, to help me navigate my journey back to shopping for fashion. We kicked off the conversation by her sharing how she transitioned to a more sustainable, conscious consumption of fashion.
I guess, transitioned to a more slow fashion lifestyle in 2015, 2016, like around there. Like it was a very gradual change, I would say. Like there were still things that I bought, but more like basics from fast fashion stores. I wasn't trying to buy like trendy pieces anymore. And I still wear those pieces still. But then like after that, I didn't always read like reports and stuff that came out, or just didn't keep up with them because I was already in a place where people were like, at least online, I was in a space where people were talking about all of these things already. So then it was more like less about how it sort of environmentally impacts the world, like there is that, but also more about like how it impacts especially like Black and brown people. I feel like around, but like just, indigenous people especially, and then also women, and like just that kind of sphere. I think like talking a lot about like culture as well.
My first question was actually going to be what motivated you to become a more conscious fashion consumer?
Okay, so I started off, I think I watched that documentary, The True Cost, and I think lots of people watched it, and that's like where a lot of people sort of were struck with the sort of unethical nature, and then some of the environmental impact, but not so much. It focused more on the unethical part of fast fashion, and so then that is what like made me realize that I needed to stop buying fast fashion. I had already sort of, living in South Africa, we hadn't gotten access to H&M and Zara by the time that I moved to Japan. So I was in Japan when I started transitioning to a more slow fashion lifestyle. So I was in Japan and they had like all of the access to it already. And so when I first got there, like there was even more fast fashion brands than I had ever had access to before. And I was really excited to be able to buy stuff from them. But then also they ended up being kind of out of my budget, which was weird. And so going to thrift stores in Japan, like the quality of the clothing is still really good and stuff. So I often actually went and thrifted, which I already did in South Africa, but the quality is a bit different. And styles are a bit different. And then I guess after watching the documentary, that was like when I made a conscious decision to thrift more and to buy less So I guess like at one point I was just like, okay, I'm just going to thrift and buy from like local brands or sustainable brands. But I was still buying quite a lot. I think I feel like I was thrifting quite a lot. I mean, I know there's lots of people who are like sustainable influencers or something, and they thrift almost like every day, and they thrift quite a lot. And that still is like questionable to me. So I now like will thrift like maybe once a month and not get as many things and only get things that I actually want to buy and wear. And instead of things that I'm like, oh, maybe it's a good idea. But yeah, so I would say that I'm still on this journey.
You also talk about how thrifting seems to have really gained popularity. If you look at it these days, there's a lot of thrifting videos, a lot of thrifting influencers. Yes, we're seeing it a bit more on social media, but are people actually becoming more conscious consumers, or we're just talking about it? I mean, when I'm thrifting, are people just thrifting for the fashion because you can get brands maybe that you could never get, that you maybe can't afford if you're buying them firsthand from the store? And yeah, so are we seeing people consuming thrifting because they're becoming more conscious consumers, whether it's more conscious of the environmental impact or more conscious of the human impact? Or is it just more fashion and we're just talking about it as a cool fad?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because there is definitely this like surge in people thrifting, but it's not always from a space of I thrift because it's like more environmentally friendly. It might be because they want unique pieces that they think nobody else can get because they're like vintage, or because, you know, like if you go to a fast fashion store, you'll see the same piece, tons of them, and there's even like more in the storage or something like that. Whereas if you go to a thrift store, you often find like only one of that piece of clothing. So I think that is like part of it, and I'm pro that. I do think that for me, even if you're doing it because it's trendy, it's hopefully like a step towards being like, okay, this can be normalized. Maybe my whole entire closet can start coming from, if I want to get like new things, then I'll go to like a thrift store, and then maybe somebody ends up saving more money if they go to like a type of thrift store that is on the more affordable side, and then they can save up for local brands. It can be like almost like a gateway, I think, thrifting, and this like trendiness of it. But at the same time, I would say that sometimes there is like an over consumption type narrative, especially on like, I'm on TikTok, and the amount of thrift hauls that I see from like the same person every week or something, and just seeing like the amount of clothes that they get. Sometimes it's things that don't fit them at all, but then they buy it because they're going to end up like just like pinning it at the back for a photo, but not necessarily keeping it longer than that photo. And then that can be, I think, unconscious or like over consuming type of capitalist way of buying and wearing clothes still. And so yeah, so I would say that but I think that's like based off different people. I can't say like, oh, this is generally what's happening, because I don't know how other people are thinking about the way that they are buying. If that makes sense.
So it does. So it's not so much people have necessarily become more conscious consumers. We've almost rebranded over consumption from fast fashion to now thrifting. But when it all comes down to it, we're still over consuming if we're buying clothes just for a picture.
Yes, true. But also at the same time, I do think that there are like so many clothes that are secondhand. And so it's not, I don't know if we can overconsume secondhand clothing at this point, but at the same time, it, you know, like it depends on like your own sort of closet and how you wear things. There's almost too many clothes in the world at the moment, and so buying secondhand, I hope, makes it so that there's less of a demand on like new fast fashion clothing. But I kind of know that that's not the case, because fast fashion brands will just overproduce anyway, no matter what the demand is.
Yeah. So maybe instead of stopping to shop for a bit, they should just stop producing for a bit and we figure out what to do with the clothes that are already there. And then maybe we can pick up production.
Yeah, that's what I think. But I mean, not obviously, but I don't think that is what like fast fashion brands would end up doing. And then it's funny because like the brands that will probably do that are the brands that we need, the ones that do think consciously. So that's like an interesting space. But yeah, I would definitely say that thrifting for me is a space that's accessible to most people, and also like kind of like a gateway space to looking into more slow and conscious consuming. And I think that it's hard to say like, oh, like we're over consuming already and that's like a bad thing. I think that we're just in this transition phase almost, like people almost have to go through sometimes still buying as much as they were before with fast fashion, and then now buying like thrifted clothing and then realizing, oh, maybe this is not good either. And then they slowly change, because I also went through that transition, so I can't judge other people.
Yeah, everyone should go at their own rate. But
yeah, or things work for different people. Like you were saying that you like went fully off buying clothes, and so I don't think I could have done that.
Yeah, but you know what? Actually, I think it's very important also for me to mention that fashion and just clothes have never been a huge part of my life. For me, it's always been more of just clothes are functional. I've never been the fashion forward person. I've never really attached them to my identity. So I do understand that fashion is quite an emotional thing, and it's probably easier for me to do than people who really do love fashion, who shop for, people who are passionate about it.
Yeah, no, I definitely, I would agree. Like it's a personal thing. It's something that you either use it to express yourself or you use it just to sort of protect yourself, right? Like clothing protects us from sun, but also from different things. And so that's why I think like I can't say, like make a statement that I feel is too judgmental on people just choosing to take their own pace. But I do hope that more people will become more like conscious consumers. And it's like a buzzword, but yeah.
Actually, let's go to that buzzword. For you, what is conscious consumption of fashion?
So I think that it's just like an awareness of the way that we wear our clothes. One thing for me is like when we talk about ethics, yes, it's about like where it was made, wanting a more ethical, like people to be paid a living wage, or at the least minimum wage, which is in different countries it's a different thing. So that's, you want a living wage for each country, and then to be in safe environments when they're making it. But then it's also about not culturally appropriating or being like aware that you're not sort of, so just being sensitive around like other people and how your clothes might be offensive to them. I think about, there's this vintage store in a town just near mine, and they sell old uniforms, which I used to wear them because like when I was in primary school, all of the other girls like on cities days would wear like their dad's old uniforms, and I never had one. So then I went and bought one, and then I wore it. And then I was like asking the owner, I was like, where is this like uniform from? What do you mean that it's the old uniform? And then she's like, oh, it was like, once the government changed, they had to change the uniform. And then it made me realize, and for some reason it didn't click before, but it was like the apartheid military uniform. So wearing that in public in South Africa as a Black person, but also as a white person, anybody who's wearing it, right, it's almost like insensitive to a lot of people. And so it's like, it's about being sensitive to that kind of stuff. It can be like a cultural garment, but it could also be like something like a uniform, and how other people's context is towards those uniforms. I think it's also about being mindful about like how much we have, and do we need more? Are we buying more because we're trying to fill something in us that we feel needs to be fulfilled, or is it, and we feel that we're lacking even though we maybe not, and being like conscious around our feelings around buying, and why are we getting something. And then sometimes people shop to fill a void that can't be filled and that there's something else that maybe needs to be sort of dealt with there. And then I would say being as low impact as one can. I try to not say like sustainable anymore, because for me, sustainable fashion doesn't exist in our world. Like, it cannot exist because we have not decolonized. And to me, fashion is, or sustainability is decolonized, and we're aiming towards a sustainable society, but we are yet to come to it. And within sustainability is ethics, and so I think that sustainability is also used or misused by a lot of, I think, fast fashion brands sometimes as well, when they talk about sustainable materials or something. So I think that's what being a conscious consumer is to me. It's just being very mindful and respectful, and thinking about how our actions within fashion affect others. Yeah, to sum it up.
When we touch on there's no such thing as sustainable fashion, it reminds me of what's currently going on with fast fashion brands co-opting the whole sustainable fashion phrase. I don't think anyone currently is using that phrase more than fast fashion. To give you an example, just this week, I was in a mall and I was talking to a friend, and we happened to talk about sustainability of fashion. And I'm just like, that store is just, she's like, no, but I was in Cotton On recently, and they have they seem to be going really sustainable. I was like, there's no way that they're such a fast fashion brand. I highly doubt that they are as sustainable as you say they are. And she's like, no, like everywhere there's signs and everything. And I'm like, okay, great. Let's go and see what's going on in Cotton On. Literally, you walk in, almost all the signs are on how sustainable they are, and just how they're doing all this amazing sustainable work, and all their fabric is sustainably procured. So we see these jerseys, cute jerseys, and I look at the label. On the label, telling you, it's written, I think something like, I'll share this on my Patreon. I'll share the picture on my Patreon. But the picture says, I used to be, on the clothing label, it says, I used to be plastic, or I'm 100% made out of plastic. And then in a smaller font, it says, this label is made from 100% recycled plastic bottles. So it's not the jersey or the jumper that's made from the recycled bottles. It's literally just the tag on the sweater, which I just thought I was like, this is low. This is so low.
Yeah, wow. I mean, I think that I've also noticed that happening sometimes on a label. It will say like ethically sourced, but they don't like say if it's the tag or if it's the garment. And so, yeah, I mean, it definitely, like, lots of fast fashion brands are, I mean, they have access to the huge sort of trend forecasting and marketing firms, and they use them. And already, I mean, if you go onto some of these trend forecasting websites, you can get sort of summarized versions that don't go into full detail of like what they forecast consumers will be like. And one of the things is that Gen Z is very into sustainability and being sustainable, in like kind of quotes, I would say. But then I think that Gen Z is also one of those people, and I'm partly Gen Z, is like, I'm on the cusp, but we aren't huge researchers sometimes, and sometimes we'll go for like headline sort of or clickbaity type articles. And so So we kind of fall for those things where it says something is sustainable, so then we just believe that it's sustainable. We don't really want to go and push into it and see more. Although I think that there is a part of Gen Z that is kind of like that, and then the part that will do the research. But that's also something that I've noticed on TikTok. Like this one time, there was this sort of, everybody was talking about how Bill Gates' wife was like putting money into. Sorry, actually, maybe it's like not a good, but it was just like, it was about just almost like a rumor that they had like found somewhere or like seen somebody else put on TikTok, so then they wanted to post about it, but did no research behind it. And then when I like looked into it, it was completely false. And had anybody just like written out a sentence about what was going on into Google, they would have found out that it was a false narrative that comes up every now and then. And then when you like ask these TikTokers, where did you get this information from? Then they'll be like, oh, actually, like I just saw somebody else post about it, and then I like posted about it. So I think that sometimes we like something that seems like very shocking or good or something, but we don't want to do our own research into it. And then we fall for these sort of narratives that are being pushed, especially by like fast fashion brands. We would like to believe that they're being sustainable. And they know that we want them to be, so they'll be sustainable in whatever way they think they can get away with, but not necessarily actually true sustainability or being environmentally friendly.
Yeah, and I think what also the danger of that as well, in as much as we'll be like, yes, it's promoting conscious fashion or sustainable fashion, quote unquote. The danger of that, then, if we're not doing our research and we come with these shock facts and they're proven to be wrong, that almost then discredits the whole movement and the whole push for sustainable fashion.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I think that people end up having like is that actually like sustainable or like, yeah, like either you have this mistrust in everything, or you just believe that it is what it is, and then you don't push for it to become better. So I would agree and that is an issue.
And then, so earlier when I asked about conscious fashion, you touched on that we should be sensitive to culture, mindful of level of consumption, emotional intelligence, impact of these clothes. There were a lot of things that you mentioned. And as someone who's going back to shopping, this can be a bit overwhelming. I mean, it's overwhelming me, and I already work within the environmental space. I can only imagine how it must be for someone who's just like, I'm just trying to consume more. I'm trying to consume more consciously and try to do as little harm as possible. What would your advice for someone who's looking to start on their fashion journey, their sustainable fashion or conscious fashion journey, and switching from fast fashion be, as someone who's been on that journey now for nearly 5 years?
I think that, so personal style is a big one. I think that finding like what our personal style is. So I do a lot of like mood boarding, or like just collecting Instagram. You know, you can save that saved feature and you can save things into a file. So if you see outfits that you like, saving them as like inspiration. I think that that's like a good place to start, just because then it helps you be like, okay, these are like the items of clothing that I'm seeing that I really like a lot, and so I would like to try those on, or see, like, try that. And so then looking into, can I get it from like the thrift store, and looking at those. There's also online thrift stores and different sort of secondhand selling markets. And then also looking at local brands and seeing if there's brands that are local to you that have these items of clothing. And then so then that's like your way of almost like looking into getting it in a more environmentally friendly way. I mean, sometimes it's good to ask the brands. It's, if you're getting it from like a local brand, like you can sometimes talk to the designer and ask more about their process. And then when it comes to like cultural sensitivity, that's almost something I feel one sometimes just learns by like making mistakes like I did, or it comes with like learning more about other people's cultures, which is always a really cool thing to do. And yeah, and then some, like, I think like another thing is that, like, for example, if you want something from a certain culture, then sometimes there's people within that culture who are making crafts that are, or like selling pieces that are part of that culture, but they're like ones that other people who are not part of the culture can wear. So they're not like sacred to the culture. And sometimes they're items that are sacred to the culture. So they won't make them for like sort of everybody to wear. And so that's our kind of a way of being sensitive towards that. And then there's lots of Instagram accounts and also podcasts like yours that people can listen to learn about these things. I think that's where I did like a lot of my learning as well.
Thanks for that. The next question for me would actually be, where do we look for reliable information besides your UN reports and your 300-page reports? Because let's be honest, we hardly ever read those, if at all. It's 300 pages. Who are the people you trust with giving you reliable information, so that if anyone's looking to get more information in an easy to consume way, they can go to them and know that they're getting information that's not only easy to consume, but that is actually reliable? So who would your recommendations be, whether it's on social media, whether they're writers or just content creators?
So there's one account that I like to look at called Give Credit, which is about sort of designers using different cultural practices and then not giving credit. So that's a good place to start in terms of like cultural sensibility and appropriation. And then I enjoy reading Aja Baba, Emi Ito, who's like Little Koto's Closet on Instagram. And she talks about like kimonos, Japanese culture, and like the appropriation of that. Aja Baba speaks just so like slow fashion in general, but also like race as well and decolonizing systems. So there's Dominique Drakeford, and she's also great. Celine Saman, who has like a sort of, I don't know if it's like a NGO or an NPO, or it's an organization though. And it's called, well, she has like these things called study hall, which is almost like these summits, but the organization is called Slow Factory, and it's an organization that also has sort of like online education seminars, and so that's also like a great place to even learn about other people within the sort of sustainability movement. And yeah, so I would, those are like great places to start. And there's, I think it's hot in South Africa, there's Twig magazine, or like they're called Twig Mag, but they're also like an online platform. Yeah, that would be maybe where I would start off at, because they're like kind of all more broad. And then I think as you go more into your like journey, then you find more and more people that speak more to your specific location sometimes, or interests.
Thank you. I'll also include these names in the show notes if anyone would like to check them out. And then in Africa, are we seeing the same enthusiasm on sustainable fashion across the continent? Is that something that you've picked up?
Yes. Oh, another person that I think people should watch is, or like it follows, the OR is Present, and they are, so the OR is Present, or the OR Foundation. They work within Accra, Ghana, and they sort of talk about the huge clothing market, secondhand clothing market that is there, and then also like the effect that it's having on the landfill and the environment in Ghana. So then to answer your question about if I think that in Africa we're also seeing this like move towards slow fashion, I think that we've already been practicing it in many ways. There's a lot of like the secondhand clothes from the Northern Hemisphere, especially America's, the like North American countries like Canada and the US, as well as European countries. A lot of their like clothing comes to Africa, and then we are the ones who will buy it. And then also before that, we had a lot of like our own artisans making a lot of our clothing and our own sort of clothing and cultural practices. So I do feel that we have been practicing a lot of these sort of slow fashion ways of consuming clothes, but we haven't been sort of labeling it as such. And I think for me, that was like a big thing, was like taking pride in what we were already doing and like highlighting that was something that a lot of people I feel in Africa have been doing. But I'm like generalizing. I don't know exactly how the like fast fashion market is in other countries. And I would say that even in South Africa at times, it seems that maybe we're not, like when people get to a certain economic bracket, they want to buy fast fashion. And I think that's like, I understand it because we've been pushed this idea of like what affluence looks like for so long. And fast fashion has even partly been part of that. I remember when I was in high school, like H&M seemed like, to me, like a luxury brand to buy from because it wasn't in South Africa yet. And so when I went overseas, I would be like, oh my gosh, I need to get H&M, as if I was getting a Louis Vuitton or something. Like, so I can understand how some people might still feel like they want to buy into fast fashion because they've been taught or told by sort of advertising and everything that this is for the world and society, that this is what affluence looks like. And when you get to a certain place in your life, that's how you should dress and stuff. And so I can't necessarily blame that, but I do think that we should take pride in the ways that we have been practicing slow fashion before, and then sort of being more mindful and buying more local brands.
Ditto to everything that you just said. Our journey back to more conscious fashion is probably shorter than most, considering that a lot of us still are there.
Yes, exactly. I think that's like kind of where we were put in this position. And a friend of mine, he says we're cleaning up other people's trash, but at the same time, we were put in this position, and then we're told that this is how it looks like to be out of this position. But at the same time, then now, as like European countries and American countries become more look towards more sustainability, then they look down on us again as, oh, you're not doing this, but we're busy cleaning up their trash and then, or their waste, or whatever they say is like their waste. And then, but we are still if we wanted to, we could, and we have the resources to have a more slow fashion sort of practice amongst all of us, because we do have the skills and talent to make our own clothes and also to repurpose the clothes that we already have. We have I think the best cotton comes from Ghana. I know that the Japanese denim, which is known as the best denim, is made with Ghanaian cotton. And so knowing that that we have the resources and the skills and even practices in many ways to create sort of the best sustainable, and this is where I think maybe sustainability, I could say sustainable fashion practice. I think that gives me hope, and then I just hope that we can sort of convince people that this is the best way before we become like what European and American countries looked like.
Yeah, and speaking of hope, so as I'm hoping to get back to the fashion journey, and anyone who may be listening to this, we've touched on a lot of things so far we've touched on here as Africa, where we are sustainable fashion consumers. We've talked about what to look out for. So our conversation thus far has been very rich in the number of things that we've touched on, and what plays into conscious fashion, what plays into sustainable fashion, what to consider. It's still been quite a lot, and might be once again overwhelming. So if there is one thing that you would like me to take from this conversation, or anyone listening to this conversation who would like to be a more conscious consumer, what is that one thing? We'll make it like the rule of thumb.
I think I need to think about that. That's such a, to have one thing that I think it's about I don't know if this is, but almost ukama, the idea of ukama, and bringing that within the way that we practice fashioning ourselves, and just the way that we are in the world, but the way that we interact with fashion, we should bring ukama into that. The idea that we are connected to everyone, like as in humans, but also other sorts of natural beings, and then also our future and past, and then when we wear clothing, or when we buy clothing, to think about how that affects the environment around us and the people around us.
That's a really beautiful way to summarize it. Masego, thank you so much for being part of this conversation and for sharing your journey and sharing your knowledge with me.
Thank you so much for having me.
And there you have it. I hope after listening to this episode, even if you don't go cold turkey from buying new clothes or necessarily shop less, I hope you're more conscious of what you do buy and its impact holistically. I've included links to Masego's Instagram page and blog in the show notes. I've also included links to some articles on sustainable fashion for anyone curious to know more, and an article on uruhama, because I found that a really interesting concept. There is an offcut of our conversation where we touch on sustainable fashion within African culture as it relates to the rest of the world's relationship with sustainable fashion, and that is available to all our patrons. If you'd like to become a patron to either receive extra content or support the production of the Sustain257 podcast, please find the link in the episode notes. I am the host of Sustain257 Podcast, Batokili Sitze, and the sound engineer is Malehoma Khoti. Follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Sustain267, where we'll be sharing this episode and continuing the conversation. Take care.
Sustain267.